Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Friday, June 30th, 2023. The Supreme Court strikes down President Joe Biden's plan for student loan debt forgiveness, ruling 6-3 that a law the president relied on does not give him the authority to cancel up to $20,000 in student loans per person for those who qualify. President Biden says he understands if people are disappointed, even angry. The president calls out Republicans for bringing this lawsuit and opposing his plan, and he announces some new measures he says will protect student loan borrowers. We'll have his statement and other reaction coming up. In another case, the Supreme Court ruling 6-3 in favor of a Christian graphic designer in Colorado who refused to create same-sex wedding websites, saying doing so would violate her right to free speech, even though Colorado has an anti-discrimination law protecting sexual orientation. Also today, Republican presidential candidates speaking at a Moms for Liberty convention in Philadelphia, including Ron DeSantis, Nikki Haley, and Donald Trump. The group is focused on education policy. Inflation moderated in a report from the Commerce Department. Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index, which is the Federal Reserve's preferred measure, increased 3.8% in May compared to a year earlier. That's down from April's 4.3%. And General Mark Milley, chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, speaks at the National Press Club in Washington on the war in Ukraine and the personal standing of Russian President Vladimir Putin, just about a week after that attempted rebellion by a mercenary group that his government funded. From the Associated Press, a sharply divided Supreme Court ruled Friday that the Biden administration overstepped its authority in trying to cancel or reduce student loans for millions of Americans. The 6-3 decision, with conservative justices in the majority, effectively killed the $400 billion plan announced by President Biden last year and left borrowers on the hook for repayments that are expected to resume by late summer. The court held that the administration needs Congress's endorsement before undertaking so costly a program. The majority rejected arguments that a bipartisan 2003 law dealing with student loans, known as the HEROES Act, gave President Biden the power he claimed. That from Associated Press. President Biden reacting in the White House.
Last year, I announced my student debt relief plan, a plan that was on the verge of providing more than 40 million Americans with real debt relief, up to $10,000 for many borrowers and up to $20,000 for those who had gotten a Pell Grant. Nearly 90% of the relief would have gone to borrowers, 90% of it making less than $75,000 a year, and no one making over $125,000 would qualify. This program was all set to begin. The website had been set up, the applications had been simplified so that it took less than 5 minutes to complete. Notice had been sent out to people about the relief they were eligible for. 16 million people had already been approved. The money was literally about to go out the door. And then Republican elected officials and special interests stepped in. They said, no, literally snatching from the hands of millions of Americans thousands of dollars in student debt relief that was about to change their lives. You know, these Republican officials just couldn't bear the thought of providing relief for working class, middle class Americans. Republican state officials sued my administration, attempting to block relief, including millions of their own constituents. Republicans in Congress voted to overturn the plan. I think every one. I don't think I had any Republican votes for this plan. At the same time, think about this. We all supported the Paycheck Protection Program, remember, PPP? You know, which was designed to help business owners who lost money because of the pandemic. It was a worthy program, but let's be clear. Some of the same elected Republicans, members of Congress who strongly opposed giving relief to students, got hundreds of thousands of dollars themselves in relief, members of Congress, because of the businesses they were able to keep open. Several members of Congress got over $1 million. All those loans were forgiven. You know how much that program cost? $760 billion. My program's too expensive. $360 billion more than I proposed in my student debt relief program. I was trying to provide students with $10,000 to $20,000 in relief. By comparison, the average amount forgiven in the PPP, the pandemic loan program, average amount forgiven was $70,000. Now a kid making $60,000, trying to pay back his bills, asking for $10,000 in relief. Come on. The hypocrisy is stunning. You can't help a family making 75 grand a year, but you can help a millionaire and you have your debt forgiven? My plan would not only have been life-changing for millions of Americans, it would have been good for the American economy. Freeing millions of Americans from the crushing burden of student debt. More homes would have been bought, more businesses would have been started, more couples would have had the confidence to start a family. Millions of people would have felt they could get on with their lives. These Republicans blocked all that. Now, in addition to the hypocrisy, some of these Republican Congress are shamelessly pushing to advance a bill in the coming weeks that gives hundreds of billions of dollars in tax breaks and handouts to the wealthiest Americans. They still haven't given up on making permanent a $2 trillion tax cut that they never paid for. Never paid for. $2 trillion. So let me be clear. For Republicans in Congress, it's not about reducing the deficit. It's not about fairness in forgiving loans. It's only about forgiving loans they have to pay. Today, the Supreme Court sided with them. I believe the court's decision to strike down my student debt relief program was a mistake, was wrong. I'm not going to stop fighting to deliver borrowers what they need, particularly those at the bottom end of the economic scale. So we need to find a new way, and we're moving as fast as we can. First, I'm announcing today a new path consistent with today's ruling to provide student debt relief to as many borrowers as possible, as quickly as possible. We will ground this new approach in a different law than my original plan, the so-called Higher Education Act. That will allow Secretary Cardona, who's with me today, to compromise, waive, or release loans under certain circumstances. This new path is legally sound. It's going to take longer, but in my view, it's the best path that remains to providing for as many borrowers as possible with debt relief. I've directed my team to move as quickly as possible under the law. Just moments ago, Secretary Cardona took the first step to initiate that new approach. We're not going to waste any time on this. We're getting moving on it. It's going to take longer, but we're getting at it right away. Second, we know what many borrowers will need to make their hard choices, which their budgets are being strained now when they start to repay their monthly loan payments this fall. You know, we know that figuring out how to pay these added expenses can take time for borrowers, and they might miss payments at the front end as they get back into repayment. Normally, this could lead borrowers to fall into delinquency and default. But without their it will hurt their financial security, and that's not good for them or the economy. That's why we're creating a temporary 12-month, what we're calling on-ramp repayment program. And now, this is not the same as a student loan pause. It's been in effect for the past 3 years. Monthly payments will be due. Bills will not go out, and interest will be accruing. And during this period, if you can pay your monthly bills, you should. But if you cannot, if you miss payments, this on-ramp will temporarily remove the threat of default or having your credit harmed, which can hurt borrowers for years to come. Because the Department of Education won't refer borrowers. And the reason why that will work, they won't refer borrowers who miss payments to credit agencies for 12 months to give them a chance to get back up and running. Let me close with this. Our Republican officials say student loan relief is a giveaway to the privileged. You hear that loud now, the privileged. I love their concern for the privileged. But I know who student loan borrowers are in this country. So do all you. The couple putting off having a child until they can find their way to deal with their debt. That's who they are. They're young putting off buying their first home so they can get out from under student loans. Hope on the horizon, thanks to relief that I planned last year. Today's court decision snatches it away from them. I get it. I get it. I hear this. And I'm concerned about it. But today's decision has closed one path. Now we're going to pursue another. I'm never going to stop fighting for you. We'll use every tool at our disposal to get you the student debt relief you need and reach your dreams. It's good for the economy. It's good for the country. It's going to be good for you. Thank you very, very much for listening. We're going to get this done, God willing. Thank you.
Mr. President, why did you give millions of borrowers false hope? You've doubted your own authority here in the past.
I didn't give any false hope. The question was whether or not I would do even more than was requested. What I did, I thought was appropriate, and was able to be done and would get done. I didn't give borrowers false hope, but the Republicans snatched away the hope that they were given, and it's real hope. Thank you.
Mr. President, will you cancel student debt?
Your authority. Did you overstep your authority?
I think the court misinterpreted the Constitution.
President Biden today at the White House. The administration says that the relief under his original plan could have applied to 43 million people and that 26 million people had already applied. Today's decision from the Supreme Court, 6-3 in Biden v. Nebraska. In the majority, Chief Justice John Roberts writing the opinion, joined by Justices Thomas, Alito, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett, ruling that the 2003 law giving the Education Secretary the power to waive or modify student loans does not justify the president's plan. The majority opinion says the Secretary's comprehensive debt cancellation plan cannot fairly be called a waiver. It not only nullifies existing provisions, but augments and expands them dramatically. It cannot be a mere modification because it constitutes effectively the introduction of a whole new regime. In the minority, Justice Elena Kagan, joined by Justices Sotomayor and Jackson, and she writes, the result here is that the court substitutes itself for Congress and the executive branch in making national policy about student loan forgiveness. She says it's no proper role for a court and is a danger to a democratic order. The attorneys general of two of the states which sued, Nebraska's Mike Hilgers and Missouri's Andrew Bailey, both Republican, held a virtual news conference today about the decision.
Today's a really important day for America because the Supreme Court's decision put a stop to what really was a breathtaking attempt to grab power by the Biden administration. This case is about $500 million of taxpayer money, but it's about much more than that. It's about how we all have decided to govern ourselves in this country. Since our founding nearly 250 years ago, from the Constitution to our practice, it is Congress, as part of our separation of powers principles, it is Congress that has the power of the purse. The Biden administration tried to pass student cancellation bills through a democratically held Congress and was unable to do so. The proper course under our constitutional system was to either persuade more people, to compromise, or to win more elections. The option that was not given to him was to unilaterally, through executive order, cancel nearly $500 billion of taxpayer dollars in student loans. Today's Supreme Court decision reaffirms the principle that has helped be a bulwark of freedom in the United States for nearly 250 years. The question now is return to Congress. That's precisely where it belongs. That federal branch is the closest to the people, and it has, under our Constitution, the power of the purse. For us and our team here in Nebraska, I promised Nebraska voters that we would be vigilant in watching federal overreach. That's exactly what we have done in this case here today, and what we will continue to do in the days, weeks, and months to come. Last, I would like to thank all of my sister states, certainly the state of Missouri, General Bailey and his team, also the state of Kansas, the state of Iowa, the state of South Carolina, and the state of Arkansas for joining us in this historic lawsuit that we filed today that led to the Supreme Court's decision. With that, I'll turn it over to General Bailey.
Well, thank you, General Hilgers, and thank you for your important leadership on this issue. It was great to partner with like-minded attorneys general across the nation to deliver this huge win for the United States of America and for the people of the state of Missouri. For me, this is about the Constitution, the rule of law, and protecting working Missouri families from getting saddled with Ivy League debt. And just as General Hilgers explained, the separation of powers doctrine means something. Our founders understood that you couldn't consolidate power in one branch of government because that would represent despotism. And certainly that's what Biden attempted here by using a flick of a pen to redistribute $430 billion in taxpayer money. So this is an important constitutional win. It's a rule of law win as well. By using the major questions doctrine, the Supreme Court once again clarified that executive agencies can't exceed the scope of their statutory authority. You can't redline statutes out and then fill in the blanks with what you want as unelected bureaucrats. You got to follow the law Congress gives you. So again, that's also a constitutional principle, but it's also about basic fairness. And as someone who paid for my college education, both undergrad and law school, in service to my nation in the United States Army, this one was personal. Paid for my college in blood, sweat, and tears in service to my country. And it's only fair that working families not be stuck with other people's debt.
Andrew Bailey, Missouri Attorney General, and before that, Mike Hilgers, Nebraska Attorney General, in a virtual news conference. Nebraska and Missouri, two of the states which sued the Biden administration over the student loan forgiveness plan and won the case today. Reaction to the Supreme Court decision from Congress, Democratic Congressman Bill Pascrell of New Jersey tweeting, "In another act of extreme partisanship and preposterous overreach, the Republican Supreme Court just struck down Democrats' modest loan forgiveness for tens of millions of working Americans. The decision is another disgrace by these Republican judges." And from Congressman Ralph Norman, Republican from South Carolina, "You borrowed the money, you received the education, you benefited personally. It is not someone else's responsibility to pay back what you owe." Another great decision by the Supreme Court. Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, Democrat from Washington State, chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, posted this video.
The extreme Supreme Court just released a terrible decision striking down President Biden's executive order to cancel student debt for 43 million people across this country who are being crushed by that student debt. A total of $1.7 trillion in student debt that is out there right now in this country. The reality is that 90% of that student debt cancellation would have gone to people earning less than $75,000. These are folks for whom this ability to cancel student debt allows them to get out from under the burden, be able to buy a house, be able to start a small business, be able to participate fully in our economy. And so many of the people affected are Black, brown, indigenous, and poor folks. This is a terrible decision from this extreme MAGA Republican Supreme Court. We will fight back. We will ensure that there is a continued attempt to cancel student debt for people across this country.
Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, Democrat from Washington State, chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. Also posting a video today on the Supreme Court's decision, Senator Bill Cassidy, Republican from Louisiana.
I was very pleased to see the Supreme Court uphold the Constitution and slap down the Biden administration's scheme to spend $400 billion without congressional authorization to transfer the burden of student loans from those who took the debt willingly to those who didn't sign up to take the debt. But we still got to fix the underlying problems. Republicans are working on that. And we've got to remind people who lose their job and can't pay back their loan or become disabled, etc., that there's a mechanism by which they can do it. In the meantime, congratulations, Supreme Court, upholding the Constitution.
Senator Bill Cassidy, Republican from Louisiana, with that video. Congressman John Joyce, Republican from Pennsylvania, tweeting, "Pennsylvanians should not have to foot the bill for other people's loans. Today's ruling is a victory for the rule of law and a blow to President Biden's executive overreach." And Senator Elizabeth Warren, Democrat from Massachusetts, tweeting, "The same Supreme Court that overturned Roe now refuses to follow the plain language of the law on student loan cancellation. This fight is not over. The president has more tools to cancel student debt, and he must use them." This is Washington Today. Now to the other major Supreme Court decision today. Associated Press reports, in a defeat for gay rights, the Supreme Court's conservative majority ruled Friday that a Christian graphic artist who wants to design wedding websites can refuse to work with same-sex couples. The court ruled 6-3 for designer Lorie Smith, despite a Colorado law that bars discrimination based on sexual orientation, race, gender, and other characteristics. Lorie Smith had argued that the law violates her free speech rights. Lorie Smith's opponents warned that a win for her would allow a range of businesses to discriminate, refusing to serve Black, Jewish, or Muslim customers, interracial or interfaith couples, or immigrants. That from Associated Press. Kristen Wagner is president and CEO of Alliance Defending Freedom, the group that successfully argued this case before the Supreme Court, and she was interviewed today on Newsmax.
It's a resounding victory for free speech and the principle that free speech applies to everyone. What was at stake in this case was whether the government itself had the power to tell people that they must say things they don't believe. And that power extends not just to those who share Lorie's views, but it would extend to the LGBT website designer who doesn't want to criticize same-sex marriage, or the Democratic speechwriter, or perhaps the pro-abortion photographer. So again, this is a win for everyone to ensure that the government can't censor, silence, punish, and even ruin people, imposing jail time for declining to express messages that violate their convictions.
Kristen Wagner of Alliance Defending Freedom, which represented Lorie Smith in the Colorado case. The decision in 303 Creative LLC v. Alanis was 6-3. Justice Neil Gorsuch, writing for the majority, saying the First Amendment envisions the United States as a rich and complex place where all persons are free to think and speak as they wish, not as the government demands. The First Amendment prohibits Colorado from forcing a website designer to create an expressive design speaking messages with which the designer disagrees. And Justice Sonia Sotomayor, leading the dissent, writing today, the court, for the first time in its history, grants a business open to the public a constitutional right to refuse to serve members of a protected class. The White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre opened up her news conference with this.
We are deeply disappointed in the Supreme Court's decision today in 303 Creative, which takes our nation backward in the fight for equality. This decision undermines the basic truth that no American should face discrimination for who they are or who they love. And it's even more disappointing as we close out Pride Month today. It chips away at a long-standing laws that protect all Americans against discrimination in public accommodations, including people of color, people with disabilities, and people of faith, and women. While the court's decision only addresses expressive original designs, as President Biden said today, we are concerned that the decision could invite more discrimination against the LGBTQ+ community. And we know that when one group's dignity and equality are threatened, the promise of our democracy is threatened, and we all suffer. The administration will remain focused on enforcing federal anti-discrimination protections, and the president will continue to call on Congress to pass the Equality Act.
The White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre at her briefing at the White House. Congressman Richie Torres, Democrat from New York, was interviewed on CNN about this decision.
The Supreme Court just ruled in favor of a Christian web designer who cited religious objections in refusing to make a website for a same-sex couple. I want to get your perspective. You're a member of Congress, but as I mentioned, you're an openly gay man. What was your reaction when you learned of the ruling?
Well, the decision is a dark day, not only for the LGBTQ community, but for democracy. And I cannot help but feel that the most consequential policy decisions are being decided not by elected officials, but by the unelected judges of the Supreme Court, particularly a right-wing supermajority. You know, the Supreme Court is increasingly operating as a super legislature, and laws become politics by other means. And this particular decision reminds us that the greatest threat to LGBTQ equality is the weaponization of religious liberty. You know, religious liberty, properly understood, means freedom from discrimination, not freedom to discriminate. And if the Supreme Court continues to reinterpret religious liberty as a license to discriminate, it's going to have implications for civil rights laws at every level of government, and it's going to have implications far beyond the LGBTQ community.
Congressman Richie Torres, Democrat from New York, on CNN. Congressman Mark Pocan, Democrat from Wisconsin, also one of the handful of openly gay members of Congress, tweeting, SCOTUS's decision in 303 Creative ignores decades of precedent and allows certain businesses to discriminate against the LGBTQ plus community and other minorities. I urge every business to serve all Americans. It's good for business. It's the right thing to do, and it's the American way. A reaction statement from Senator Ted Cruz, Republican of Texas. Before today's ruling, the state of Colorado wanted to compel the speech of Christian artists and business owners who declined to use their God-given talents to celebrate views that run contrary to what their faith teaches. This law wasn't just a threat to Christians either. Should a Muslim artist be compelled by the government to draw the image of Muhammad? Should Jewish artists be forced to create art that is anti-Semitic? That statement from Senator Ted Cruz. You can find the full Supreme Court oral argument audio in this case, 303 Creative LLC v. Elenis, and the case decided today, striking down the president's student loan forgiveness plan, Biden v. Nebraska, at cspan.org, our video library. This is Washington Today. Republican presidential candidate Ron DeSantis, Florida governor, talked today about Thursday's Supreme Court decision that struck down affirmative action in college admissions. He spoke at a convention in Philadelphia held by the group Moms for Liberty.
We've also enacted a positive vision for higher education. And you hear a lot of complaints from conservatives and others about the politicization of higher education, the ideology. And yet, how many people have actually done anything about it. So in Florida, our view is very simple. Our public university system is supported by taxpayers, and it needs to serve the best interests of the state of Florida. It is not there to impose an ideological agenda on the students. It's not there to foment political activism. It is there for the pursuit of truth. It's there to promote academic rigor, and it's there to prepare our students to be citizens of this republic. So we're reorienting it into that direction, and we have meat on the bones. And I remember when I was in college, I had never seen some of the leftism that I saw. And I was like, man, this is crazy. But I always told myself, none of this will fly once you get off campus. Once you get into the real world, this stuff doesn't work. And I believed that then. Fast forward now a couple decades, the joke was kind of on people like me who thought this wouldn't get beyond the campus, because it's now that ideology has seeped into all these institutions. And so it matters that we get higher education right. In Florida, all tenured professors now must undergo review every 5 years and can be let go. We saw yesterday the Supreme Court uphold the Constitution and say no racial discrimination in college admissions. And in Florida, that's been our law, so we didn't allow, so it's not going to impact us. We're colorblind admissions. But Florida's the first state to go even further than that. We have eliminated DEI from our public universities. They say it's diversity, equity, and inclusion, but the way it's practiced, it's ideology imposed on the institution. And the way it's done in practice, DEI better stands for division, exclusion, and indoctrination, and that has no place in our public institutions. So Florida shows you can not only stand up to the left, you can beat the left, and you can even beat them in institutions that they, for decades, just assumed was their little playpen where they can do whatever they want.
Republican presidential candidate and Florida Governor Ron DeSantis at the Moms for Liberty convention in Philadelphia today. Washington Post reporting on this convention says this weekend 5 Republican presidential candidates, including frontrunner Donald Trump and his leading rival, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, plan to take the stage at the Moms for Liberty Summit in Philadelphia, highlighting their conviction that educational issues will mobilize their base in the 2024 election. The Washington Post article also notes that a month ago, the Southern Poverty Law Center declared Moms for Liberty an extremist group devoted to spreading messages of anti-inclusion and hate. Candidate Nikki Haley also speaking today and then sitting down for an interview.
So you're running as a Republican, but a lot of the issues that we've discussed so far today aren't partisan issues, or certainly shouldn't be partisan issues. So a message to voters that are listening to you right now, Democrats, independents, what is it that you want them to know? How do we get back to these being human issues and not political issues that are used to divide Americans?
We have to get back to our national purpose and the values that make us great. You know, I saw the protesters outside.
Right.
And I appreciate that, because that's what my husband and every military man and woman fight for, is the freedom of speech to be able to do that. The freedom of speech for you to be in this room.
I don't love the sexualizing children part. I'll just be clear about that, right? So some of it I have a disagreement about, but again, not partisan.
No, but when you talk about the fact, just that they can say it, we don't have to agree on it, but they can say it. Yeah. But the same way in this room, we can say what we care about. And you know, the thing is, stop demonizing people because they have a different opinion. And at the end of the day, we have to remember that without knowing the political bias of anybody in this room, we agree on 80% of the things. It's 20% that we fight over, but 80%. So why can't we at least see results on the 80%? At the end of the day, we're not seeing anything happen in D.C. And you've got families now, we feel like we work for the government. That's not the way it's supposed to be. Government's supposed to be working for us. And that's why when I become president, what I think is hugely important is I will make sure that we reduce the size of the federal government and send it down to the states. I will meet with governors not once a year like every president. We'll meet with them every quarter, and we will give them the ability to do things on the state level, whether it's healthcare, whether it's education, whether it's benefits, all of those things, because one, that reduces the size of the federal government and it empowers people on the ground. We've got to get back to that. That's the part that I know we can do. We've got the solutions. It just means you got to get to work and get it done.
Republican presidential candidate Nikki Haley, who's a former governor of South Carolina, former U.S. ambassador to the UN, at the Moms for Liberty convention in Philadelphia, speaking with the co-founder and director of the group, Tiffany Justice. The group started a couple of years ago by three moms in Florida opposing COVID-19 mandates. Now says it has over 100,000 members and over 280 chapters in over 40 states. On Wall Street today, the Dow up 285, NASDAQ up 196, S&P up 53. From Associated Press, an inflation index that is closely monitored by the Federal Reserve tumbled last month to its lowest level since April 2021, pulled down by lower gas prices and slower rising food costs. At the same time, consumers barely increased their spending last month, boosting it just 0.1% after a solid 0.6% gain in April. The inflation index showed that prices rose 3.8% in May from 12 months earlier, down sharply from a 4.4% year-over-year surge in April. And from April to May, prices ticked up just 0.1%. That from AP. Washington Today continues in a moment.
When citizens are truly informed, our republic thrives. Get informed straight from the source. On C-SPAN. Unfiltered, unbiased, word for word. From the nation's capital to wherever you are. Because the opinion that matters the most is your own. This is what democracy looks like. C-SPAN, powered by cable.
Welcome back to Washington Today, which you can get as a podcast wherever you find your podcasts and on the C-SPAN Now mobile app. Story from the New York Times. Nearly a week after a short-lived rebellion that challenged President Vladimir Putin's authority, Russia's top diplomat delivered a message to Western adversaries on Friday, insisting that the country would emerge stronger and more resilient. If someone in the West has doubts about this, then that's their problem, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov told the news conference. His comments were the latest Russian effort to project normality following the aborted uprising amid a series of highly choreographed public appearances by Mr. Putin aimed at displaying his strength and popular support. That from the New York Times. General Mark Milley, chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the United States, was asked about President Putin at an appearance at the National Press Club in Washington.
In your assessment, has Russian President Vladimir Putin been weakened by Prigozhin's revolt this last Friday? What are the implications for the war in Ukraine? Do you have any indications that Russian popular support for the war is eroding, or did Prigozhin's quick advance through Russia-held areas mean there's an appetite in Russia for an even more aggressive military campaign against Kyiv?
That's like 8 questions.
I know. Do you want me to take it one at a time?
Yeah, I won't be able to remember all those. So, yeah, go one at a time real quick.
Has Russian President
Who
Vladimir
asked that
Putin...
one? Who was the name associated with it?
I won't even look in their direction. Has Russian President Vladimir Putin been weakened by Prigozhin's revolt last Friday?
Don't know yet. I mean, frankly, it's probably too early to tell. We watch that stuff. At the end of the day, it's a matter of internal Russian politics. There's nothing we're going to do about it either way, but we certainly want to assess it. We want to know the answer to that question. So there's arguments, good arguments, on both sides. You know them all. You're writing about it every day. So there's arguments that say, yep, short-term weakness, long-term strength, long-term weakness, short-term strength. There's arguments, 22 different ways from Sunday on this thing. I don't think we have evidence, conclusive evidence, either way yet. Too early to tell. Putin is a dictator. He's a vicious, violent individual who has ordered the killings, the extrajudicial killings of many, many people. He's a tough guy, a hard guy. And how he responds to what happened there over last weekend with Prigozhin, I think history can tell us some indicators of what might happen, but to say that this will happen or that will happen, I don't think we know yet.
Okay. Do you have any indications that Russian popular support for the war is eroding?
Yes and no. Nothing I would say that's definitive about the entire Russian population. That's a lot of people, 140 million people. And I don't know of any, nationwide Gallup polls or any of these kind of things. So, but there are some indicators, right? So when the mobilization was called up, was it a couple 100,000 that were called up a while back? There were a lot of people who fled that country. A lot of military-age males primarily got out of Russia. That's clearly an indicator. There is some, grumbling that there's dissension with the significant amounts of casualties. You're talking about a lot of casualties that Russia has suffered coming back to their country. And then, of course, Prigozhin, right? So Prigozhin's out there and does whatever he did, mutiny, attempted coup, whatever it was supposed to do. But he's out there making a case. He's been making the case for months that this war was predicated on a lie, that this war is not successful, this war needs to come to an end, that sort of thing, right? So interesting argument from a guy like Prigozhin. So anyway, he's out there. So those are kind of indicators. And there's many others that are in the open media. I think you can go on a wide variety of social media probably inside Russia. You guys can probably do that better than I can do it. But yeah, I think there are some indicators. I wouldn't say that they're definitive or conclusive or that it's going to result in some outcome one way or another.
General Mark Milley, chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the National Press Club. He also said the U.S. is considering providing to Ukraine cluster munitions, which open in the air and then release bomblets that cover a wide area. And that's to help Ukraine in its slow-moving counteroffensive against Russian forces. General Milley noting that Russia is using cluster bombs and Ukraine has gotten them from European countries. But as an Associated Press article writes, the bomblets have a high rate of failure to explode, up to 40% in some recent conflicts, according to the International Committee of the Red Cross. And proponents of banning cluster bombs say they kill indiscriminately and endanger civilians long after their use. From BBC News, a new high-resolution satellite image obtained by the BBC reveals hundreds of new tent-like structures at the site of a suspected Wagner camp in Belarus. This follows an agreement to relocate Wagner mercenaries and their controversial leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, to Belarus following the recent mutiny against Russian forces. That from BBC. But John Kirby, spokesperson for the White House National Security Council, saying today that the U.S. is not sure that leader is there.
Our first question will go to Steve Holland with Reuters.
Hey, John. Thanks for that. What can you tell us about Prigozhin's current whereabouts? Is he in Belarus or somewhere else?
Yeah, the truth is, Steve, we don't have information that we consider deem reliable enough to be able to confirm his whereabouts. I mean, we've seen reports, just like you've seen reports from Lukashenko that he's in Belarus, but we're not in a position to independently confirm that.
John Kirby, Strategic Communications Coordinator for the White House National Security Council, in a virtual audio briefing with reporters. The Marine Corps hymn played at the Marine graduation ceremony at Paris Island, South Carolina, where First Lady Jill Biden spoke, celebrating the 50th anniversary of the U.S. Armed Forces being a fully volunteer force. Today, in 1973, the military draft authority expired and was never renewed.
For 50 years, Americans like you have chosen this path. Our all-volunteer force of the brave and the bold. Just 1% of our country take up the mantle of keeping all of us safe. As my husband says, it is our sacred obligation to that military service is an opportunity of dignity and honor, of pride and accomplishment, not just for our service members, but for those they love, the families who answer the call of duty as well. That's why I launched Joining Forces, my White House initiative to support military and veteran families, caregivers, and survivors. And as you build your lives, grow in your careers, and create communities that move throughout the country and the world, know that we are grateful for everything you do, and we are working every day so that you never have to choose between love of country and your love of family.
First Lady Jill Biden at the Marine graduation ceremony today at the Marine Corps Recruit Depot, Paris Island in South Carolina. The Selective Service System website has this. From 1948 until 1973, during both peacetime and periods of conflict, men were drafted to fill vacancies in the armed forces, which could not be filled through voluntary means. Induction authority expired in 1973, but the Selective Service System remained in existence in standby to support the all-volunteer force in case of an emergency. Registration was suspended early in 1975, and the Selective Service System entered into deep standby. And that draft authority ended today in 1973, 50 years ago. Christine King Ferris writes in the New York Times, the last living sibling of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. died on Thursday. She was 95. Ms. Ferris, Dr. King's older sister, supported him politically and personally, the paper writes. She joined him in 1965 for the March for Voting Rights in Alabama and in 1966 for the March Against Fear in Mississippi. She also lent him money so he could buy his engagement ring. In 2008, C-SPAN 2's Book TV interviewed Christine King Ferris about her book, Through It All, Reflections on My Life, My Family, and My Faith.
As you look at the world today, what is the most profound changes that you have seen in civil rights from now back to the days when you were marching and working with your brother in terms of changing the policies of this country?
Well, there is a change, at least outwardly. We don't see many of the vestiges of segregation and discrimination as we saw it then. So that has taken place, but of course there is still some type of segregation. We still have not reached the point that all people are accepted for who they are. And we still have a ways to go, but I think with the election of Mr. Obama, that speaks volumes to minorities, and it says, you know, that what we've always said to our young people, you know, that you can achieve and you can be accepted and be somebody. And I think that this election has said that to particularly to minorities.
Christine King Ferris, sister of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on C-SPAN 2's Book TV in 2008. She has died at the age of 95. Senator Raphael Warnock, Democrat from Georgia, tweeting, I'm deeply saddened by the passage of Dr. Christine King Ferris, the longest-serving member of Ebenezer Baptist Church. As the sister of Georgia's greatest son, Martin Luther King Jr., she fused the lessons of civil rights and education as a Spelman College professor and passed that training born of experience to students who now serve all over the world. I'm praying for her family. She went on to witness the long arc of American history bend from many changes, many of it pushed forward by her own brother. As her pastor, I can say that up until the very end, she embodied hope, dignity, and a deep faith. Long live the memory of Christine King Ferris. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Sign up for C-SPAN's evening newsletter word for word to get the stories Washington is talking about sent to your inbox every day. Subscribe at c-span.org/connect. Have a good night and weekend.